Now, usually when I come into a setting like this, usually I hear, and I heard it again tonight, you know, he doesn't look like a spy. And I never know whether to be crestfallen or happy, you know. And I still haven't figured that out, but I will tell you that it's kind of indicative of kind of a TV movie view of what CIA is all about. And so what I'd like to do is just start out with a brief word about what CIA was supposed to do when it was set up and where it is now. There were two main reasons for setting up CIA. One was so there'd be one central place, you know, one central place where all the information on a given country or issue was gathered. For those of you with no gray in your hair, you may not realize this, but we used to have in-boxes made out of wood. You know, you put things in the in-box, you know. And so I was the happy recipient every morning of all the information, whether it was collected from embassies or our own spies or satellite photography or intercepted messages, you name it, it would be in my wooden inbox. And I would be the central intelligence agency responsible for, well, this is a word that fell out of use in Washington, accountable for looking at this, making some sense out of it, and if there was an important enough story that day, writing it up, getting it past the editors, and chances were that the President of the United States and his chief advisors might be reading about that the next morning. My chances are a little better because my count was the Soviet Union. My graduate degree was in Soviet studies, and there was always great interest in that. So that was the main reason. And then just as important was that Harry Truman realized that he needed one place, one institution in government without a political agenda, okay? That's why he didn't put it under the State Department, that's why he didn't put it under the Defense Department. He wanted somebody to go to and say, look, Mr. Director, I want you to tell me what you really think. You and those two universities where the specialists you have out there in the woods of Virginia, I want to know what you really think. I don't care what the State Department says, what the Defense Department, I want to know what you think. Now, put yourself in the position of a president. How else could you make an orderly foreign policy without having somewhere to go to ask for a truthful answer and be able to have some reasonable assurance that that person is going to give you a truthful answer, okay? Now, for 27 years, until the very end, I was able to do that. It was heady stuff. If we were to be faulted, it would be only because we took a perverse delight in telling the president that we thought the Soviets were only 5'9" and not 9'5", as the Defense Department said, you know. But depending on the director, and most of the ones I served under 9, most of the ones I served under had integrity and honesty and courage, we were able to tell it like it is, okay? Now, there's another part of the CIA that was sort of tacked on as an afterthought, and that's the stuff that you read about a lot. That's the covert action part. Suffice it to say, at the time the agency was being set up under the National Security Act of '47, the question arose, what do we do with the OSS? Now, those of you will know, some of you will know, the OSS was the Office of Strategic Services, which did miracles in the European theater and in the Far East during World War II. Now, that was a capability to do things, to mount operations, little paramilitary operations of all nature of covert action things. And the question was, what do we do with these guys? The war's over. Do we send them back to their law firms, to their corporations, to academe, you know? Well, the Soviets were pouring over Eastern Europe, threatening Western Europe. They almost won the election in Italy, were it not for some timely covert action from our OSS alumni. And the question answered itself. No, you can't just disband this capability. We have to have something to meet the KGB with, okay? Then, big mistake. Where do you put it? Well, somebody said, well, we're creating the CIA, why don't we put it there? Well, folks, that's where the structural fault came in. You can't have one person responsible for an objective analysis of foreign policy. An objective analysis, let's say, of what's going on in Nicaragua. Is Nicaragua a kind of place that the Soviet Union is going to have a beachhead and come on up through Mexico into Texas? Give me a break, you know? But if the president and his chief advisors think it is, or suspect it is, and decide to wage a little war in Nicaragua to prevent that, okay, and they put the same director in charge of this war, what kind of credibility does his analyst have? You know, his analyst goes to the Hill, and they say, what do you think of the chances for the Contras? And an honest answer would be, you know, Contras, you know. But he's working for the guy who's running the Contra war. So all I'm trying to say is that this is a structural fault that hopefully will be addressed at some day. The analytic part in which I worked was hermetically sealed from this stuff that overthrew governments and stuff. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, people say, well, CIA did this, CIA did that. Well, the CIA really didn't do anything that the President of the United States didn't tell it to do. So the way you attack this is you elect a president with integrity, or you change the law. Because right now the president can use the CIA any way he damn well pleases. Because the language of the 1947 Act reads, after they talk about these primary duties, reads thusly: the CIA shall discharge such other functions as the President and the National Security Council shall from time to time direct. So it's all very legal, folks. The President can use the CIA any way he wants. The only check used to be what we call the oversight committees of Congress. The ones in office now have given a new word to oversight. They call it now the Overlook Committee, you know. It's a joke. It's a real sad joke for those of us who've been in the business. So just to set the stage for what we try to do in the days, at least when I was there, as we watched Iraq evolve, and particularly after 9/11, when I say we, I mean there's a sort of informal group of alumni and alumnae, analysts, former analysts with the CIA who sort of kept in touch and would write an occasional op-ed and that kind of thing. Well, we were all aware that before 9/11, both Condoleezza Rice and Secretary Colin Powell had said, and this is a virtual quote, Saddam Hussein has nothing in the way of weapons of mass destruction. He's not even a threat to his immediate neighbors. Colin Powell, February 24, 2001, Condoleezza Rice, July 29th, 2001. So Condoleezza Rice saying that, let's say, was that 6 weeks before 9/11? But now, as you all know, after 9/11, everything changed, right? Okay. So we were being asked to believe that before 9/11 there were no weapons of mass destruction, but right after 9/11, Rumsfeld and Cheney were all telling us that there were all manners of weapons of mass destruction. And so well, we've been asked to believe that the weapons of mass destruction descended like manna from the heavens for a soft landing on the sands of Iraq. So we could see that the intelligence was being played fast and loose with. And that's when we started Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Why the sanity? Because there wasn't a heck of a lot of sanity in Washington. And the people running our policy were well known during the 80s, when the first President Bush was in power, as the crazies. I mean, that's the way they were universally referred to at all levels of government, and I operated at all levels of government, so I can tell you that. Okay, you come in on Monday morning, somebody said, Ray, guess what the crazies did late Friday? I didn't know exactly who the illusion. It would be Wolfowitz, it would be Pearl, it would be, you know, people in the White House are still there. Elliot Abrams, for Pete's sake, you know. So when we saw the new President Bush come in, and this time with the crazies, but now in policy-making positions, we said, well, here we're in for quite a ride, and we didn't know the half of it. You see, his father had a good sense of picking good advisors, and so he had General Scowcroft as his national security advisor. He had Jim Baker at State, and these two people were really pretty rigorous in saying, Mr. President, okay, you can't get rid of the crazies. The right wing of our party will go berserk. But keep them in places where they can't do any harm. Keep them at middle levels of the Pentagon. Sit on them. Don't let them do any harm to our country. And he did. And so the rest of the story is what they did with the new President Bush. I won't rehearse in detail the deceptions that were used to, quote, justify the war. Let me just cite a few. Weapons of mass destruction. Well, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law defected in 1995. And we interviewed him, as did the UN inspectors in Jordan, and he came pretty clean. And what he told us, among other things, was that all the weapons of mass destruction that were left over from when the UN inspectors destroyed 95% of them, all of those were destroyed at his order right after the first war, okay? So they said, well, what do you mean at your order? He said, well, I was in charge. I was in charge of the missile, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs. And so I ordered them all destroyed, and so they were. And he pointed them to some residual biological laboratories. And everything he told us checked out. But somehow the administration conveniently forgot all this in the period before the war. And there's no excuse for it, because a good friend of mine gave that to Newsweek 6 weeks before the war, and they published it. You know, just a little in the Periscope part of Newsweek. Guess how quick the New York Times and the Washington Post were to pick up on that? Well, they never did pick up on that. They were all rooting for war. They were leading the cheerleading, okay? And so that's, you know, that's just one thing. Now, there are a couple other things I'll just mention. That cockamamie story that Iraq was seeking yellow cake uranium in the African country of Niger, you all know about that one, right? Well, when that came in, you know, the analyst looked at it and he said, Niger doesn't control the uranium mined in Niger. It's controlled by an international consortium headed by, of all people, the French. There's no way in God's heaven that any of that uranium can be siphoned off onto, you know, and given to Iraq. And besides, we know that Iraq has all manner of yellow cake uranium already in country. The problem is not getting yellow cake, the problem is refining it to a more refined stage. So they put it in the circular file where it belonged. But the vice president thought that was a very interesting report, okay? And you know the rest of the story with Joe Wilson and all. Several months later, we learned that it was based on a forgery, okay? Now, who do you suppose did the forgery? Now, the FBI was right on it, right? No. So it was a report that was false on its face, and it was based on a forgery. And the only thing it reminds me of is, some of you will remember Yul Brynner in The King and I. Remember that one wonderful time when he gets up and he says, "So, it's a false lie." That's what we had here, a false lie. And there were a lot of other things. There was one other thing that really sticks in my craw, and that is, you remember the resurrecting of a mushroom cloud to scare us all? Okay. Well, in order to do that, they had to corrupt the intelligence to get an estimate to say, yeah, Saddam Hussein will get a nuclear weapon. He's reinstituted his program. No evidence to support that, just the vice president saying it, okay? So they go around the room with all these intelligence agencies. Okay, Army, how soon do you think that Saddam Hussein can get a nuclear weapon? 5 years. CIA, 7 years. NSA, you know, they go down the line and say, State Department, this is kind of difficult because you're asking us to predict the end of a program that we don't really see any evidence that it's been restarted. And so it's real hard for us to predict how soon he get a, you see our problem? Well, they wrote a very diplomatic page-long footnote. Well, that's what the State Department was being asked to do, predict the end of something that didn't even happen yet. Now, most of those things might have been known to you, but more recently, and it's really escaped much attention, is the testimony of Tyler Drumheller. If you're familiar with him, he was an operations guy with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was pretty proud because his guys had recruited a very high-level Iraqi person. Now, in the intelligence business, what you need is somebody who's reliable and somebody who has access to the information you need. This fellow happened to have a pretty good record because we had turned him, okay? He had turn to talk to us confidentially and give us information. His record was pretty good, and he had pretty good access because he was the foreign minister of Iraq. The foreign minister of Iraq. So my friends in the operations department were pretty proud of this, and they could say, well, no longer do we need to hang our heads in shame and say we don't have any human sources. We got the foreign minister, So they told the White House, we're coming down with some information from the foreign minister, and they proudly gave it to the president and to his chief advisors. And he read, there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And the warm welcome dissipated. And it was made clear to these people who had risked their lives to approach this fellow, and for him who had risked his life to cooperate with us, that there was no interest in this. And they were expressly told, look, we don't want any more intelligence like this. It's not intelligence, it's regime change. That's what we're doing now, okay? That's 6 months before the war, folks. So, and that, for those of you who saw Tyler Drumheller on 60 Minutes, it was about 2 months ago. You can get the transcript, but those of you who hadn't heard of that, I forgive you because the mainstream media are not real quick about picking these things up, are they? So what we had, folks, pure and simple, let's not shy away from it, is what the Nuremberg Tribunal called a war of aggression. And Nuremberg defined a war of aggression in this way. To initiate a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only in that it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Accumulated evil of the whole, like what? Like kidnapping? Like holding incommunicado without any notification of the Red Cross? Like torture? The accumulated evil of the whole. Now, I'd like to talk just a little bit about where we are now in Iraq, because I think most people are aware that this war was started for reasons other than non-existent weapons of mass destruction and non-existent ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And it was the latter that I felt that I would brace the Secretary of Defense with. It was, maybe I'd say a word about that. I was down in Atlanta for a different reason, but when I heard he was coming down, I said I had to go see him. I had to hear him speak. And it was real hard for me to do this because I'm sort of Scotch-Irish here, and I heard it was going to cost me $40 to get in there. I went in there, and I sat down close to where I saw the microphones were for the questions. I had no real intent to do much, but when one of the ladies cried out that he told a lot of lies, Mr. Rumsfeld, you tell a lot of lies, you're a liar, and she was carried out. What really got me was Rumsfeld sort of, you've seen him do it, sort of wringing his hands and saying, oh gosh. When someone accuses the President of the United States of telling lies, I just feel... Now, no one had accused the President of the United States. They accused Rumsfeld of telling lies. I just feel that is so destructive of the trust that's necessary to govern, that it's so wrong. It's so wrong. Now, I'm Irish. I'm sitting there in the fourth row. So I decided then and there that I would take advantage of my good colleague Paul Pillar, who retired late last year and who for the last 5 years was the National Intelligence Officer for the Middle East. That means the guru, the guy who is in charge of all the analysis for the Middle East, not only in CIA, but in the intelligence community, okay? And he had just given an interview to El País, the Spanish newspaper, the day before, and he said, what this regime, the Bush regime, was guilty most of, in my view, forget the weapons of mass destruction, was cultivating the misapprehension that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, okay? And one reason they did that, of course, is because That's the authorization for war powers. I mean, it had to have to do something with 9/11. People forget that, okay? But it was more sinister because it played very cynically on the fears, on the trauma that we all suffered from 9/11, okay? And what my friend Paul Pillar said was there was an orchestrated campaign of manipulation of that intelligence information, so much so that 69% of us American people, when the war started and well into the war, believed that Saddam Hussein did have something. I dare say, if you took a poll now, you know, I hate to say this, but I think a majority of American people would still believe that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. And when you talk about this kind of lie, it's a consequential lie, folks. Because when the GI, who comes back from looking for terrorists, you know, in Baghdad, after having shot up a whole bunch of people, you know, women and children included, comes back and the interviewer, the press person says, well, how do you feel about that? He said, well, come on into my room. And I go into the room, he says, look there. He's got a picture of the burning towers in New York, the Twin Towers. He says, that's how I feel. It's payback, pure and simple, payback, you know. That's consequential lying, folks. So anyhow, make a long story short, Paul Pillar had that very morning published this business about the orchestrated campaign of deceit. And then I remembered that Rumsfeld himself had said that the evidence of ties between Al-Qaeda and Iraq was bulletproof, you know, bulletproof. At a time when General Scowcroft was saying it's scant, you know. So I said, hey, you know, maybe I'll get up there. I'm pretty close to the microphone. I'll just ask him, where'd you get that bulletproof, you know? All my colleagues at CIA were saying there was no evidence. Scowcroft says it's scant. The 9/11 Commission said there was no evidence of operational ties. Where'd you get that? Were you misled or was it a lie? What was it? And so I got to ask that question. And you probably know the rest of the story, but it was really a matter of just being there and it, you know, being angry, really. I got a call, a very interesting call from a leading media personality about 15 minutes later. Ray, weren't you afraid? Weren't you nervous? Weren't you addressing the Secretary of Defense that way? And I said, no, to all those things. I was angry. I'm Irish, and I hate to see people deceived that way. Well, let's say a word about where we go on Iraq now. I have studied the great philosopher Yogi Berra. And he famously said, predictions are very, very difficult, especially when it's about the future. Now, there are basically two courses. One is stay the course, and the other one is withdraw, okay? On course A, stay the course, Yogi Berra is dead wrong. That prediction is easy. There are a lot of people here who've been there, done that. It's called Vietnam, folks. It gets more violent the next month, more violent the following month. Lots of people get killed. 8 or 9 years later, they pull out what's left of our presence off the rooftops of the green zone. We know that, okay? Don't take it from me. We have 55 former intelligence specialists now involved in VIPS. I can call the best people that I know that used to be in government on insurgencies, on counterinsurgencies, on Arab states. I'm relying on that kind of expertise. It's just like being in a kind of mini CIA, but this time you know you're going to get a straight answer, you know, okay? And that's what they all tell me. We know what will happen. There'll be more and more violence, okay? So that's option A. Now what about option B? Option B, Yogi Berra is right. Don't let anybody tell you it's going to be easy, okay? Withdrawal is, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but there are sensible ways we can do it. First of all, we need to talk to the insurgents or the terrorists, or, you know, I call them the resistance, the people who don't like to be occupied, you know, it's sort of picky, you know? They don't like us in their country, okay? We need to talk to them, okay? We don't need to act like, you know, great white fathers or parents. You know, I liken it, and I've been told by people who are really expert that this is a good analogy. I liken it to the situation where my wife and I, when we were first married, we had 3 children pretty much right away. And we wanted to go out to the movie on Friday night, you know? And we'd be all set to go. And as soon as we started to go out the door, the kids would start fighting tooth and nail, you know, which program would they watch, you know, and everything. And for 2 years, we put our coats back in the closet and stayed around and didn't go to the movies. And finally we wised up. Finally we said, look, we're going to the movies, you work it out, okay? And guess what happened? They worked it out. They worked it out. And the situation is very analogous in Iraq now. If they don't have any parent to play off or to go to or anything like that, they're going to have to work it out, okay? So if we talk to these folks, help them work it out in a real sense, and then disavow any intention of having permanent, whoops, I slipped. They're not permanent military bases. What are they? Anybody know? Right. Believe me, if all those enduring young military bases. Give me a break, folks. Okay, enduring military bases. If we disavow any intention of having those things, and then any intention of having special rights to the oil, what's going to happen? Then and only then can we expect the Europeans, the Arab League folks, the Indians, the Pacs, to come in behind us and help us exit as gracefully as is possible at that point, okay? Now, is that because they like us, because they're altruistic? No, they hate us. They hate us. But they have an interest in stability there. They have an interest in the oil. And so there's a reasonable expectation that they would come in and help us to withdraw. Now, again, you can't be sure, but what I am assured by the experts with whom I'm in touch, and we have a record of having said 2.5 years ago that this war is unwinnable. I mean, we could see what it was. I'm advised that no one believes that the violence from withdrawal would be anywhere near the great violence of our staying for a long period of time, okay? And under those conditions, I think it's a moral question, folks. I don't see how any politician can sit back and pretty much say, well, we'll fund this thing, we'll keep funding this thing, and you know, these kids from the inner city and the farms, I can't find much anyway, so we'll see if they can, we'll see if they can stay the course for us for a little while, you know, and who knows, maybe we'll luck out, you know, and we'll get a couple people killed, you know. I had a well-heeled person from Pewaukee, Wisconsin. Anybody know about Pewaukee? It's a very affluent subsection of a suburb of Milwaukee, okay? He comes up to me after election, he says, Mr. McGovern, what's your problem? What is your problem? You don't doubt that we need the oil, do you? I said, no, I mean, part of my lecture was about how much we can peak oil and the rest. He said, well, you know, you have to admit that 5, 6, 7 GIs killed every week is a very small price to pay for the oil that we need. I mean, in Vietnam, we lost hundreds in a week. And I said, my God, you know, I knew that this was in the subconscious of a lot of Americans, but I never heard it articulated before. And so I said to him, well, I thought, well, maybe this guy would be most susceptible to the argument from pragmatic, you know. I said, well, they're not going to let us take the oil. You know, there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. Iraq has porous borders. We're just not going to be able to do it, you know. And he said, sure we can do it, sure we can do it. We're the sole remaining superpower in the world. And so I said, well, maybe I ought to hit him with this. I said, well, suppose it was your son, one of the 5 killed last week. And folks, it was very clear that he had never even thought of that. It had never occurred. You know why? Because what he said was, it wouldn't be my son. And it wouldn't be his son. And that's part of the problem here, part of the deepest problem, okay? And then I said to him, I said, well, are you one of those folks that would like to have the 10 Commandments in the courthouses and the schoolhouses? This? He said, yeah, that would be a good idea. I said, well, I'm a little rusty. I said, but there's one that thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Shalt not steal. There's one about killing, I think. And there's one about lying about it. And you know, there's even one that says, thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord hard in vain, and it seems to me there's a lot of that going on there too. Maybe you ought to subtract 5 and just put 5 in and just go there. Well, he turned around and went to his SUV and peeled out. But folks, a warning, you know, there are an awful lot of Americans that have been sold this bill of goods. You remember in the first Gulf War, it was to defend our way of life, okay? And that's pretty insidious because our way of life requires that we have a vastly disproportionate portion of the wealth of the world, and first and foremost, the supreme commodity, oil. Let me talk a little bit here about Iran. It would be crazy to bomb Iran. Everybody who knows anything about it knows that, because Iran can retaliate, among other things. But the crowd running our policy toward the Middle East do not put their decisions through the craziness filter. The president's numbers are way down. The state of Israel, which seems to have a real hold on this president, don't take my word for it, take Brent Scowcroft's word for it, who says when Ariel Sharon was around that he had our president mesmerized, his word. He had our president wrapped around his little finger, again, Scowcroft's words. Now, I don't take those lightly because that guy knows which end is up, okay? The Israelis are hell-bent and determined not to have their nuclear monopoly in the Middle East in any way endangered or eroded. They have from 300 to 400 nuclear weapons, and they don't want Iran certainly to get 1 or 2. Now, what's going on in Iran now? Well, folks, as we speak here tonight, there are U.S. Special Forces and U.S. Marines in Iran, okay, helping the Azerbaijani minority, of which there are millions, helping the Baluchis, helping the Kurds, helping everybody who's disaffected from the Iranian regime, including helping MEK. Anybody know what MEK is? That's the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, a terrorist organization of the worst kind, listed as a terrorist organization by the U.S. Department of State. And that means, folks, that according to U.S. law, we are not allowed to help a terrorist organization. We're not allowed to train them, to outfit them, to arm them, to do anything with them. But Mr. Rumsfeld is doing it anyway, as he's wont to do. What authority does he have to do that? Well, he justifies it by force protection. Protecting forces where? In Iraq? So they're in there, they're trying to stir up trouble against the regime, and they're also painting targets for the time when our Air Force, you know, the blue suiters are telling the president, hey, look, piece of cake, you know. You know how those of you who know Vietnam, the Air Force knows how to do all this stuff. They can do it from real high, you know, and you know, don't even have to risk being shot at. And man, it's just precision, and they'll go home and they'll have drinks in the officers' club. It's the infantry that's left to mop up, right? Okay. So the blue suiters are after the president, persuading him. They can do that, and it'll be a piece of cake. Now, it's not going to be a piece of cake. It'll be Iran can retaliate. And what might they do? Well, some of you know that Iran has a worldwide network of terrorists that dwarfs any capability that Al-Qaeda has, okay? And I mean worldwide. They have capabilities of shooting down, sinking ships in the Gulf, and they could very readily send 3 divisions of Revolutionary Guard troops across the Yalu. And by the Yalu, I mean the Iraqi border. And where are our guys? Our guys are looking for terrorists, you know, they're kicking down doors and looking for insurgents and terrorists and stuff. They're not equipped to meet an Iranian army. So what will happen? Well, the worst case is that our president will be told, well, you know, don't have enough forces to do much else, but we have these mini nukes, you know. That'll show them, you know. Now, why do I say that? I say that because I believe that. I say that because this is a real danger, because this crowd sees no real distinction between mini nukes and high explosive weaponry. And there's no one around to say, but I disagree, Mr. President. Police powers. As most of you know, the foreign intelligence-oriented services, CIA, NSA, have traditionally been prohibited from having any police powers, powers of arrest in this country. No more. If the Intelligence Authorization Bill is passed, Pete Hoekstra has written into that Intelligence Authorization Bill expanded police powers for the CIA and the NSA in terms of ostensibly protecting facilities in and around CIA and NSA headquarters, but giving them power of arrest over things, crimes that they see committed that have nothing to do with NSA or CIA. Those National Guard troops that are going down to the Arizona border, guess what? The people in the Senate staff are looking at ways to revise posse comitatus. That's the law that forbids the use of the Army to enforce internal police functions in this country. Now, under the guise of allowing them expanded powers to handle all these refugees or immigrants and so forth, that too is being eroded. I want to just finish with a couple of observations here. I've learned a lot from listening to my children when I was smart enough to listen to them, and now my grandchildren. And 2 years ago, I was on a TV program, and my daughter Kathleen was watching with her little daughter, or granddaughter, Claire. And when it was all over, Claire went to her mom and said, "Mommy, that was Grandpa." And Kathleen said, "Yeah, that was Grandpa." "Oh, Mommy, that means the other people are real too." Now, folks, I want you to think about that a little. I want you to think about it deeply, because as cute as it is on the surface, it holds a profound truth. If you don't know someone in the picture, the other people aren't real too. We don't even have the photos of what's going on in Iraq, unless you're really adept at the web. They're never in our mainstream media. You recall those photos from Vietnam, that poor young girl fleeing the Mapam, the chief of police shooting out the brains of a suspected terrorist, you know, the whole business, okay? None of those pictures now, okay? And so we're at one remove here from what's really going on. And that's dangerous because it's all too easy for us to write op-eds and make speeches and have interviews and not stick our necks out, get our bodies engaged, and do what we really should. I feel guilty of that myself. Now, that feeling was really enhanced when I had the privilege of being out in the far west with a woman named Faisa Al-Jarradi, an Iraqi engineer, highly educated, very good in English, who was touring around during March. Well, at every turn, as Faisa poured her guts out about what was happening to her family and what was happening to her friends, she got this reaction: "Oh, that's terrible. That's awful. That's really, but what can we do? What can we do, you know?" And finally, the third time in Santa Cruz, she sat down next to me, and she grabbed my pad, took it here, took out her pen, and she wrote down what she really wanted to say. I've got it committed to memory. This is what it was. So, the American people don't really think it's good what the American government is doing, but they don't know how to stop it. The American government doesn't care to listen to the American people and just continues to wage the war. Where is the key to helping my Iraqi friends? At the beginning of this meeting, I feel sorry for the American people. But now, after listening to time and time again the stupid phrase, "But what can we do?" I no longer feel sorry for them. I feel sick. She puts that right on my nose. Now, I'm not a real perceptive or sensitive person. And so I don't usually get it, but I did get that this was profound. Okay. So I think the time has come to think about how we not only talk, but we act. And I'm delighted to be with the kind of people who are already acting in many respects. I think we need to react more pronouncedly, and I think we need to do that for a lot of reasons. One is that there's a direct parallel between Germany in the 30s and our situation now. And I've always had a curious affinity for that area. I've studied it quite a bit in history, and then I lived in Germany for 5 years. And so I had all manner of opportunity to ask Germans, big and small, how could it happen? How could it have been you, among the most educated, the most cultivated people in the West, how could you have sat there? How could your churches, your Catholic Church, your Lutheran Church, how could they not have found their voice watching what Hitler did, all very legally, all very calmly? Martin Luther King said at one point, there is such a thing as too late. And JFK was fond of citing an expression that originated with Dante, I think, and that is that the hottest fires in hell are reserved for those who remain neutral in times of crisis. These are times of crisis, folks. On the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Pentagon Papers, there was a big celebration at the National Press Club. There were 5 people from senior positions at the Times, in the New York Times, and 5 from senior positions in the Washington Post, who had been at middle levels when these decisions were taken, and everybody was very proud. Oh boy, we faced down Nixon injunction and all that. That first injunction ever in our history, and the last one we hope, but boy, we went ahead anyway and published that. And Dan made a nice speech, and then a woman in the audience raised her hand. She said, no, sirs. And they were all sirs, you know, because in those days they were all sirs. Sirs, suppose someone came up with the equivalent of the Pentagon Papers now and gave them to you today. Do you think that your papers would publish? It was that quiet for about, it seemed like 5 minutes, but it was that quiet for about 30 seconds. And finally, Rick Smith, who was with the Times, and he's no longer with the Times, but the others were still with the papers, he said, well, I rather doubt it. I don't think so. They went down the line, and each one said, no, probably not. And by the end of the line, says, no way, we're our papers. And I'm looking at that, I'm saying, my God, there it is, right in front of me. And you know what impressed me? There wasn't a tinge of embarrassment or remorse. And these were people at senior levels now of the New York Times, the Washington Post, with every reason to advertise their courage and everything else, and not a tinge of embarrassment. That's just the way it is today. And I said to myself, wow, what further need have I for proof? So that's where the press is. Now, the good news is we've got the net, we've got the internet, we've got the web. We've got to use that better. We've got to encourage young papers, regional papers like you have here, which are really good, and get the word out. Find other ways, because we can't depend on the New York Times. This is the biggest sea change that I've witnessed in the 43 years that I've been in Washington. Washington changed pretty closely, and that is that we no longer have, in any real sense, a free press. Not only did the Iranians approach the Israelis, they approached us. And we know this from Paul Pillar, a fellow I referred to before, who told us recently that the Iranians had made all manner of approaches to us to have direct talks about these problems. The Iranians were very cooperative after 9/11 in running down the Al-Qaeda folks, and they tried to parlay that into a more decent relationship with us, and we were just rebuffed. It's not about nuclear weapons, folks. It's no more about weapons of mass destruction than the Iraqi thing was. It's about regime change. We want to have regime change there so that we can have a more docile regime in there, keep a enduring military bases around there, and control that part of the world. Why? Because the world is running out of oil, folks. That's where most of it is. The Chinese and Indians, their needs for oil are skyrocketing. So what we've really witnessed here is the first of the resource wars of the 21st century. And we're not interested in working it out in that kind of thing, because we want to preserve our way of life, and that means a disproportionate amount of oil, and we'll use it. We'll use our forces to do that. I've been called a Christian, although I kind of wonder about that term these days. You know, it's a little embarrassing when you're embarrassed to be called a Christian. Anyhow, I got myself on a Christian radio station in Charlotte, North Carolina. I guess it was on false pretenses, because the young man was quite nice to me until I started talking about George Bush and the kinds of policies that and he got increasingly, you know, not visibly because I couldn't see him, but he said, "Now, sir, I don't agree with that," but, and finally he said, "Now we have to have a station break." So he came back 2 minutes later with this, exuding this new confidence, okay? He was a different guy, and he said, "Now, Mr. McGovern, let me just start out by saying that I already mentioned I don't agree with things you said, but you know that George Bush is a Christian, and you know that he's a born-again Christian, and so how do you square what you've been saying about George Bush with that?" I said to myself, wow. So I let it go for about 10 seconds, and I said, "Well, I've thought a lot about that. It doesn't square, does it?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, it just doesn't square, you know, with the Christian that I know, with the Jesus of Nazareth taught." And he said, "Oh, well," and then let's go on to the next question. And it was just a real awakening for me, you know, that so many people out there really believe that since George Bush says he prays at night, you know, since his father said, as he did, that George W. Bush has read the Bible through 2 times, okay? Well, I got a couple of passages that he missed, you know? See, I'm old enough to have believed the Warren Commission findings. I'm old enough and naive enough to have believed the inquiry from when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. So never, never again will I cast aspersions on so-called conspiracy theorists. I have the utmost respect for people who are looking into 9/11. And I think that they're doing a job that should have been done, of course, by the 9/11 Commission, which was on purpose, was not. So my bottom line is, there is a cover-up, folks. There's clearly a cover-up. And the question is, what's being covered up? Now, you may find this hard to believe, but people who have worked in the federal bureaucracy kind of know that there is no end to the federal bureaucracy's ability to screw up. I mean, just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it does, okay? So it's a real possibility that this is gross malfeasance, gross negligence, just a whole bunch of things that just didn't go right. That's becoming increasingly difficult for me to believe. Suffice it to say that, you know, the 2 great books I find on this are David Ray Griffin's books, the Second Pearl Harbor, New Pearl Harbor, and then the 9/11 Commission, Omissions and Distortions. And the evidence is all hanging out there. So many unanswered questions. Why are they unanswered questions? Because the administration refuses to answer the questions. And so, you know, if they want to dispel suspicions, why don't they just answer the damn questions, is what I'm saying, okay? So what we need to do is pursue this. Does it strain credulity for me to believe that the Vice President knew something about 9/11 and caused the stand down of some of our planes? Not at all. He's capable of that. And there's circumstantial evidence. You know, here he is in the bunker with Secretary of Transportation Mineta. This functionary comes in and says, 10, forget the exact minutes, but 10 minutes out, sir, same instructions? Yeah, same instructions. 5 minutes later, 4 minutes out, sir, same instructions? Yeah, did I change the instructions? 3 minutes later, something piles into the Pentagon, okay? Now that's sort of suspicious. Now how did the 9/11 Commission treat that? They didn't, you know? And here's the president down in Sarasota, at that grammar school, okay? Yeah. You've all seen the 9/11 stuff, you know, blinded in the headlights, okay? But think about it. Andy Card tells the president the second plane is hit, right? You saw that, okay? What you didn't see or hear is the Secret Service guy who said immediately, "We're out of here." What happens? My pet goat for the next 23 minutes, you know? Everybody in the world knows where the President of the United States is, and yet he stays there. So somebody countermanded the instinct of the Secret Service. Somebody knew that the President was not in danger, and that he could read his book, And, so merrily go off to the airport where the plane was ready and go up and ask Cheney where to fly to. And of course, the circumstantial evidence includes the writings of the Project for the New American Century, and that's famous essay which said, we can do all these things as a superpower, and it'll be much easier if there were a catalytic event, a catalytic catastrophe like Pearl Harbor, So you don't have to be paranoid. You don't have to be conspiratorial to look into these things. And so I would urge each and every one of you. There's a lot of brain power here today, I can see. Pay heed to these folks. There are interesting videos out there and lots of stuff. And don't be deterred by people saying, you're a conspiracy theorist. These are very serious people for the most part, and they ought to be read. When you think of your children, as I do now my grandchildren, what kind of a place are we going to leave to these folks? And how are we going to answer our grandchildren when they say, what did you do? Or why didn't you do more when our democracy was being taken from us? So I think each of us needs to sort of sit down in a serious way and discern what's possible for us. And the only guideline that I know is don't do anything alone. You need a community. You need it can be real small, but you need some folks to hold you accountable, to give you guidance, to keep you from going off half-cocked. And I feel very privileged to have that kind of community that's sort of restraining me and, telling me to keep my temper. So get a small group around you and then realize that, as Cesar Chavez used to say, talking won't do it, writing won't do it, interviews won't do it. What you need is to act, okay? And you can't wait for a majority to act. There are enough of us. We need to act now. And without action, you're just kidding yourself. So what kind of action would that take? Well, there are civil disobedience ways to do it. The 8 who occupied Senator Gregg's office there in Concord, I guess. And so, just find something that you feel comfortable in doing. Maybe it's a little stretch for you, but try it, but do it with a small community of folks. And if there's time, I can tell you, first time I got arrested when the Catholic worker types down there in D.C. said, Ray, we want you to come along with us here and just join in a liturgy outside the White House on the 12th anniversary of the incineration of 408 Iraqi women and children in the shelter of Al-Amaraya during the first Gulf War, when smart bombs from U.S. planes found their way down the ventilator shafts and incinerated 408 women and children. They thought that should be observed. They should that should be marked. There should be something in front of the White House on the anniversary of that day, all the more so since it was February 13, 2003, and it seemed all but certain that we were going to do the same thing again. So we did that, and it was an experience that, it takes 5 minutes to tell you, but an experience I wouldn't have missed forever. We were arrested, we were put in prison, we went to court, and I tell you, you get involved with committed people who know what they're doing and why, and you have all kinds of biblical quotations fulfilled in your presence. They're going to throw you into court. Don't be afraid of what you say. We'll be given the words to say. Just remember that this is your time for witness. So when McGovern's running out the door, his Catholic worker type said, stay here, we'll talk to the judge. And we gave her a full account of why we were doing what we were doing. And when he ended, he said, now, Your Honor, it was an African-American woman. My friend Art Laffin said, well, Your Honor, I imagine we'll be seeing each other soon again. We left, and then they explained to me the reason why the arresting officer didn't show up. She was a black woman officer, and we talked to her in the van where we were kept for several hours before we were put in prison, and we told her what we were doing. And it was very clear to my friends, that never occurred to me, that civil disobedience can be contagious, that she was not going to be any part of this stuff because it would be her sons, or her husband, or her uncle, or her brother who'd be sent over there to die in Iraq. And we explained what we were doing. So she didn't show up in court to press charges against us. A major offense for a policeman. And so I'm saying, wow, you think that's what it is? Ray, very often this happens, people do this, so it is contagious. Bottom line, get involved with a small group of committed people, and then kind of discern. So, we're going to set ourselves a month to discern what it is we can do that's a little bit more of a stretch than we've been accustomed to doing, because the times call for it. And I really do believe that we have between now and November to do it. And that's why I fear, I didn't even mention this with respect to Iran, that the president's poll numbers are one of the things that's driving this. Because I can see Karl Rove and the rest of them saying, look, you need to do something drastic. You need to become a war president again. You need to be able to strut around and say, our guys are engaged and we got a major war in our hands. And that sounds terribly cynical, but I've watched these guys for the last 5 years. It's not at all cynical, it's realistic. So I think we really only have a couple of months to do our thing, and I think the earlier we get our act together, the better. Well, the big thing right now is to cut off funds for the war. I mean, I can't abide people who say, I voted against it before I voted for it, or I voted for it before. I mean, my goodness, Kerry made me sick last this time around. And now to have folks who say, I'm against the war, but now I'm going to vote for funding it because we don't leave. The only thing that will speak to the Pentagon is, it's just like Vietnam. But that didn't happen until we got out in the street, folks, until enough people were affected. Now, this time there's no draft. And that's a real impediment because people aren't affected. But people of good conscience need to be affected even without a draft. And that's why I appeal to you. Whether you get out in the streets or you find some equivalent, we need to do it, and we need to do it right quick, because otherwise it will just go on. You know damn well that the framers of our Constitution came out of that English experience, where the king would merrily march people off to war, for their own good, of course, but the people wouldn't have a word to say about that, okay? And they were hell-bent and determined to prevent that from ever happening in this country. And that's why in the very first article of the Constitution, they reserved the power to declare or authorize war to the elected representatives of the people, not in the executive, but in the Congress, okay? And they must be turning over in their grave now, watching at our lukewarm, our weak-kneed, our unbackboned representatives not standing up and say, this is too much, because it is.